So a meeting of the board of directors was called, and the new chairman of the board is Ralph Nager. He calls the meeting to order and says, "Gentlemen, I've called this meeting to order to discuss ways for us to increase profits and cut costs." A young man jumped to his feet and said that the losses suffered by our claims window can be traced directly to unsafe products. Some of these products are unsafe at any speed. Let me give you an example of these unsafe products that cost us profits and add to our claims losses. Take the seat belt, for example. When seat belts are used by riders in cars, our losses to the claims are cut in half. What I propose to do is that we should push for consumer protection laws so that we can control the product that the people buy. If we can control the product as well as the use of the product, we'll cut costs and increase profits. Needless to say, the board was ecstatic. By 1980, what we need is mandatory insurance. So a meeting of the board was called, and the chairman of the board was David Rockefeller. He called the meeting to order and says, "Gentlemen, the reason I've called this meeting to order is for us to discuss ways in which we may cut costs and increase profits." A young salesman new to the board addressed the group and says that many people drive on our roads who are not insured. They drive an old car worth $100, and when they have an accident, they always hit a Porsche. Then, without any insurance, they can't pay the damages, and we end up paying for the Porsche. I think we need a law that requires every driver to carry insurance. This will not cut down on claims, but it will guarantee that every car is paying a premium, and this will increase sales. And it will cut losses at the claims window and increase profits. The people will love it because it'll be more fair to the insured. Because after all, if I have to be insured, why shouldn't you have to be insured? They'll reason that if they have insurance, why shouldn't everyone have insurance? The board was ecstatic. In 1990, the board of directors was called to the meeting to decide what we need to do, gentlemen, is to ban all hazards. A meeting of the board of directors is called. The new chairman of the board is Jimmy Cartier. He calls the meeting to order and says that I've called this meeting to discuss ways for us to cut costs and increase profits. A dour, sober old man rises eloquently and addresses the meeting by saying, "For 90 years now I have been addressing the problem, or we have been addressing the problem of increasing profits and cutting costs to the insurance industry. I've held my peace for 90 years and now I have the ultimate solution. It's plain that insurance is for the health, safety, and welfare of the people. It's plain that we are in the insurance business for only one reason, and that is security of the people. And it's also plain that we're in the insurance business, or we are here, and that we are interested in the security of the people and their happiness. It's plain also that we want to give them air without pollution, cars without accidents or injury, and eternal life. And for all of these blessings, we only want a small premium. And for the small premium, we will grant you limited liability to remove from you any responsibility for your actions. Gentlemen, today I propose the ultimate insurance policy that will deliver to every policyholder total protection from every hazard imaginable. I call it the padded cell policy. We shall go to the legislature and pass laws that requires every person, natural or artificial, to buy this policy just like we do with auto insurance. We place the policy holder in a padded cell to protect him from falls, broken hips, and muggers. We put his car in storage so that he cannot be killed by a drunk driver. We close his factory to eliminate pollution. We take his guns to ensure no suicide or accidental shootings. We filter the air into his cell to eliminate all pollutants. We prepare his food to eliminate cholesterol, sugar, white flour, and other harmful products that could make him sick, which would make him very unhappy. We keep the policyholder away from all power tools and hobby crafts. This will prevent home accidents. Only sponge baths will be allowed to prevent falling in bathtubs. No more rides on airplanes, and that will prevent deaths in airplane crashes. No alcohol or other dangerous drugs. No cigarettes, and this will prevent lung cancer. In short, gentlemen, we will eliminate every single possible hazard from our policy holders. We will collect the premiums and pay out nothing in claims. The people will love it because they're getting full coverage in limited liability and total security. No rights are involved because the policyholder is reduced from status to total contract. We cannot lose because there will be no claims. Now all we have to do is to determine the premiums. Needless to say, the board was ecstatic. The police state imposed upon the Polish people by force in 1949 is no different than the police state that we Americans have imposed upon ourselves. There is one gigantic difference in the adoption of the systems. We paid to have our rights subjugated to limited liability of contract. The Poles saved a lot of money in the process. We Americans still have our Constitution, and we can reject the limited liability and perpetual debt slavery in feudal tenure whenever we want to accept responsibility for our actions and debts. The Polish people cannot. There are not many people who want to trade their slavery for the rigors of the life of a free man. But for those few men and women who want to be free, we offer in these tapes and in our schools a system whereby you may obtain that freedom. To teach anyone who wants to be free how to be free. Not everyone in America registers his car with his government, and not every man or woman in America asks the government or its permission to drive or has a license to drive. 22 million Americans don't pay income tax. There are even some free men who don't pay personal or real property taxes. The flame of freedom is involved, and every person who wants to be free can free himself, but no other man can free him. Only a free man who wants to be free and is willing to free himself can truly be free. So every person who wants to be free can free himself. Redress of grievance comes on the courtroom floor, not in a political rally, union meeting, or a letter to the editor. The courtrooms are open, and they're manned by knowledgeable jurists who will listen to and who know how to rule in favor of a man's natural inalienable rights, if that man knows how to claim those rights. And those same jurists know how to slam the door on a slave in limited liability and leave him in his security. There is no security in freedom. Or I should say, there is no security if you want freedom. Only boundless opportunity. For those that want the security of limited liability, there is only slavery. Well, there are thousands of free men in America, not millions. We like to call ourselves the land of the free, but we're not the land of the free. We are a land of serfs on the land in feudal serfdom because we pay taxes on the land. And very few people own their land free and clear, and very few people, to my knowledge, are free of the encumbering contracts of limited liability. The masses of people like security and welfare, limited liability, dejection in their lives. To claim rights, you must be compelled to defend your rights on the courtroom floor. Now you'll notice that we've used a treatise to illustrate the difference between freedom in America and freedom in Poland. We did at one time have freedom, And as a matter of practical fact, we still have the right to freedom under our Constitution. The reason that we're not enjoying those freedoms is because we have opted for limited liability for our debts. Some of the ways that we have opted for the limited liability are obvious. Some others are not so obvious. I receive calls constantly from farmers in the Midwest, especially. We've received a number of calls because people have said, well, we're being foreclosed upon. Our government, through this or that agency, is about to take our land or about to take our property. Years ago, I worked for a very interesting old fellow, and I think it's worth telling the story because in order to be free requires effort and diligence. To be a slave requires only the opportunity of the moment. It requires no real character. At the time I was about 14 or 15 years old, I wasn't driving yet, and I remember walking down an old country road, and I stopped and there was an old man cutting thistles on the side of a hill. And I said, "Hi, I'm looking for a man named Frank Rocha. I've been sent here by Bud Clark's insurance agency to work for Frank Rocha." And the old man looked at me with almost incredulity. He said, "You're not going to last a day with Frank." And I was a little surprised, and I asked him, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, Frank is from Portugal, and I can see that you're from the city by the way you dress. When you get over to Frank's, you'll work there about one day, and he'll fire you." Gosh, I thought, is there any need for me to continue walking down the road? Well, he went on to tell me that Rocha's place was the third place down, about another mile and a half. So I thanked him, and I walked on down the road, and as I walked down the road, I began to think about my status. I says, uh-oh, it looks like to me that I'm not going to make it with this guy because other people don't make it with this fellow. I wonder what it is about this crusty old foreigner, this alien who came from some country in Europe. So I got over there and I talked to a fellow up at the barn, and he said, "Oh, that's Rocha down there." And I looked down into the fields, and this is 1955, and I saw a team of horses working a mowing machine. Friends, a team of horses in 1955 was even a strange and bizarre sight. And it looked like to me that this was an austere man who might reap where he had not strawed. So I walked down there and I waited at the gate, and he pulled up and he stopped and asked me what I wanted, and I said, "I'm here from Bud Clark to go to work. What do you want me to do?" And he looked me over, and just like this old fellow down the road had said, he sized me up, and he'd already made up his mind, I think, that he was going to can me. And so he asked me, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "I'm a milker." That's what you wanted, and that's what I am. Well, okay, it's about 3 o'clock. I'll bring the cows up. Go stash your clothes, and I'll meet you in the barn. So we started in the barn, and the old guy came out, and we started to work. And that was my very first job, and I didn't know what end of the cow to put the machines on. And so I watched the other guy, and I went to work on it, and after about 5 minutes, he was a little uptight, and he grabbed me by the arm, and he took me out into the milk machine room, and he just read the riot act to me. Just like the man down the road had said. And he said, "Why did you come in here and lie to me and tell me that you were something that you weren't?" I said, "I talked to an old guy down the road. His name was Bagnuda, and he told me exactly what you were going to do to me, and that you were going to fire me the very first day, and that I wouldn't make it with you for a day." And I said to myself, in the mile and a half that it took to walk down here, that I was going to outsmart you. And here's what I did. When I walked in here, I didn't know which end of a cow to put the milk machines on, but now I do. When I walked in here, I couldn't get them on, but now I can. And when I walked in here, I knew I was going to face a mean, crusty old man who was going to fire me the first day. And while it came to pass, and I didn't last a day here, the next guy I go to, I may last a half a day. And the next guy I go to, I'll make it for a day or two. And by the time I've done this 5 or 6 times, I'll be able to hold a job. And that was where Rocha looked at me and he spit on the floor. I'll never forget this. And he shook his head and he said, "I've never seen anybody like you before." And I said, "You'll never see one like me again." Now let me ask you a question. It's obvious that you need somebody to work here or you wouldn't have called the employment agency. And it's also obvious to me that you don't keep your help here because you're too mean to them. Now, why don't we work out a deal? I'm willing to work for you free because I don't know anything. Are you willing to teach me what I need to know? You know, he was absolutely dumbfounded that I would offer to work free if he would teach me what I need to know. Well, isn't that what people did when they came from England to the United States in the early days to pay their passage? Didn't they sell themselves into slavery? Didn't they volunteer themselves to the bootmakers so that they could learn how to make boots? Yeah? And he was too embarrassed at that offer, and he said, "I don't think I would make you work free or could even accept that." Okay, let's try it this way. I'll go to work for you doing whatever it is you want me to do, and I can learn whatever it is you want me to learn in darn short order. If I can't learn in a week, well then, it hasn't cost you anything, and it's given me an opportunity so that when I go to the next guy, I'll have a better chance at a job. You can only profit and you cannot lose. He thought. That's a heck of a deal. I'll tell you what I'll do. And so he gave me some very simple menial tasks. And I think I wheeled milk cans out and put them in the cooler, and I cleaned the barn and did some other things, and pretty soon, you know, I worked for that guy for 6 years. That's right. I worked for that guy for years. That was the hardest place in Lolita, California that you could get a job. There weren't very many men that could work there for longer than 3 or 4 months at a time because of the hard work, the number of cows. See, this old guy had come from Europe, and he told me one time, he said, "You know something, boy? Any Portuguese can make it in this country and make it easy. There isn't a one of you that can go to Portugal and even survive. You'll all starve to death over there. That's how tough it is. You guys don't know what tough is." And I noticed as I worked for the old fellow that he couldn't write his name. When he wrote a check, he would scratch his name on the bottom of it, and it never said Frank Rocha. I don't know what it said, but everybody recognized the same scratches on the bottom of it. And he always had 200 to 300 tons of hay in the barn, and he never borrowed from anybody. I don't ever remember the man buying a bale of hay. I remember him selling hay. I don't ever remember a time when the feed salesman came that he couldn't write the check right on the spot and pay the bill. I don't ever remember credit. I remember that there was a flood about 1955. In fact, it was that very same year, as I recall, and then another one about 1963 or 4. And while all of the rest of the farmers around the area didn't have enough hay in their barns, Rocha had enough hay in his barn to carry him for 2 or 3 years. Always. When the other farmers were going to the banks and crying to the government for aid, he never cried to anybody for anything, even though he was just as eligible for low-interest loans as every other farmer in the valley. And I remembered at the time, everybody laughed at him And everybody thought he was crazy because he failed to take advantage of the low-interest loans from the federal government and failed to take advantage of all of the new modern mechanized equipment that he could buy for easy terms and easy payments and increased profits and cut costs. The only guy I remember that as late as 1970, when he died of old age, still had 2 teams of horses in the barn. I think he was probably the last man in Northern California that knew how to use a team of horses. I don't know if he saved gasoline or not. All I know is that he owned the land free and clear. He owned his cows free and clear. He had 200 or 300 tons of hay in the barn all the time. It didn't matter what disaster ensued, because when the floods came, he had a hill to put them on, and he had hay to feed them. He was totally self-sufficient, and he was the first free man I ever met in my life. He was free from the government. He was free from the banksters. He was free from every debt. He was freed from all of the worry and the anxiety of making the payments and of losing his property. And he couldn't even write his name. And it seems like to me that the more we go to college and the smarter we get, the less able we are to perform under our Constitution the same rights, or to claim the same rights, or to exercise our lives and our freedoms in the same way that Frank Rocha did. It was the toughest place I ever worked in my life. I don't think if I lived to be 110 you could work longer. I mean, we worked at least 14 hours a day. We were up at 4 in the morning and we went to bed at 10 at night. And we had an hour off for lunch, and on Sunday we were off from 10 to 3. And we did that 7 days a week, and I did it for years. And I thought that was normal. It wasn't until after I got out of high school and went to work in other places that I found that I was living the abnormal life and learned how to get checking accounts and credit cards and to go into debt and to increase profits and cut costs, which ultimately led to the loss of all of my freedoms, which then put me into the Atlantis Company with 28 credit cards and numerous contracts with the EPA and OSHA and my corporate charters and my debts. And that's the lesson that I think we need to learn with the law enforcement growth industry, because that law enforcement growth industry isn't something that put itself upon us. It's something that we put upon ourselves. And anytime we want to put it off of ourselves, all we have to do is begin to exercise those constitutional rights and responsibilities that are mandated by our Constitution at Article 1, Section 3, wherein there is a certain number of free persons, remember? And then there are the free persons who are bound to service for a term of years. Now, I'll concede that we have a monster on our hands, but that monster can be reduced in size for you personally proportionate to your debt service and your use of the banks and your use of interstate commerce and your use of government privilege. If you want food stamps, then you're going to be a government slave. If you're a farmer and you want those soil bank payments, then you're going to be a government serf. You're a serf on the land because you don't know how to assert your rights. And as I've noted in the past in Proverbs 26, that the righteous are as bold as lions, and the wicked flee when none pursue. And part of the wickedness is this thing of usury. We charge usury to one another, and we pay usury. And there's a curse that goes along with our practices. We use paper money, and there's a curse that goes along with the paper money simply because as you use paper money, you're stealing from your neighbors. And as you steal from that fellow, and he steals from the next fellow, and he steals from the next fellow, we become a nation of thieves. And a nation of thieves cannot prosper. And a nation of serfs cannot be free men. Now, I'm going to send you this law enforcement growth industry brief because it's not only important and necessary for you personally to know and understand what the cause of the problem is. Here's the cause. The cause is with megabucks in giant insurance companies and multi-billion-dollar corporations like General Motors. We want the privileges and the benefits of the easy life because it's, for some reason, it has some certain benefits of security. When we make bricks for the Egyptian, even though we don't like the tyranny that's imposed upon us, somehow security locks us in. Because there are leeks and garlics here in Egypt. And there's that uncertainty over there. You go out into that wilderness and gosh, what will we eat? And there are no leeks over there, and there are no quail over there, and gosh, we just have to have flesh between our teeth and leeks and garlics. Well, all I can say to that is, you cannot have freedom without responsibility. If you want an insurance policy, you're involved in interstate commerce. If you want the insurance policy, if you want the easy payment plan, if you don't want to pay cash for the car, then you're going to have to mortgage the car, and if the car is mortgaged, it doesn't belong to you. If it doesn't belong to you, you have to have a license to drive the bank's car. And the bank insists upon having insurance to insure their interest, their ownership. And so, whether you're a farmer out in Kansas or whether you're a housewife in Seattle or a businessman in San Francisco, we have enmeshed ourselves in a way of life. The entire way of life revolves around MasterCharge, Bank AmeriCard, and checking accounts, driver's licenses and insurance policies. Bob Hallstrom told me there was a time when he paid $600 a month to insure all of his toys, his boats and his motorcycles and his cars and his home and his liabilities, And I can remember when I was running companies that we paid as much as $2,000 or $3,000 a month for limited liability for debt. And the insurance company is sitting there with this potential loss, and they want to regulate you. If you've got fire insurance on your house, they want a fire inspector to come in and make sure you don't have gasoline next to the furnace. When you insure the house, nobody cares if you've got gasoline next to the furnace. And that's where responsibility comes in. If you're going to be responsible for your actions, then you can be a free man. And if you don't want to be responsible for your actions, then you cannot be a free man. Now, what are we going to do with all of these lawyers and policemen and these increasing budgets to make us ever more secure? Well, I want to cover those subjects. Now, let's take a look at some of the nomenclature. Now that we know the problem, let's take a look at the cause. I'm going to contend that the root cause of all of our problems is usury. Now, I know that's a pretty broad statement, but I'm going to show you something here, as I've pointed out, concerning money, concerning debt, and concerning these contracts and loans for limited liability that's been buried here in Scripture for, at least 2,500 years. And I doubt seriously that very many people take a look at the subject matter of interest. Interest is something that we all pay, that we all charge. From the time we're a little kid, we put our money in the bank. I remember when I was in the 3rd grade, I think it was the first year that the kids had these little banks, and you put your coins in there and you got a savings account. And in those days, it paid 2% interest. And we were taught from the time I was a little kid in school that I was supposed to get interest. That's when I put my money in the bank. And then when I went to the bank to borrow my own money back, I paid 6% interest. And somehow I never did figure that out until I was 37. That was when I learned how to count. Somehow it never dawned on me that putting it in for 2 and paying 6 to use my own money didn't make good economic sense. But then after all, I guess I was trained in the government schools to think that way, wasn't I? The subject matter of usury occurs in the Scripture 23 times. Out of the 23 times it's spoken of positively once. That's when an Israelite charges usury or interest to a foreigner or an alien. Twice in the neutral, which was where Christ said in Luke and Matthew that you ought to have put my money to the exchangers and the bankers. Those were the aliens. And the other 20 times it's spoken of negatively, but it's spoken of more negatively here in Ezekiel 18 than any other place in Scripture. In fact, it is so negative that I'm going to contend that the entire problem of America today rests upon money. We can go to HJR 192 and we can say, hey, that's it. Or we can go to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and some of us will say, hey, that's the beginning point. That's when the Warburgs and the Rockefellers really laid us away. Or we can point to some other economic changes like the Coinage Act of 1965 wherein silver was taken away. Or we can point to some other laws or statutes or times. But you know, all you're pointing to with the Coinage Act of 1965 is a symptom. And all you're pointing to with the Federal Reserve Act is another symptom. And HJR 192 is simply another symptom of an overall deeper, more all-encompassing problem that unless we really get rid of the cause, we'll never get rid of the disease. You go to a medical doctor and you have cancer of the breast and he says, what we'll do is cut it off. You go into a doctor and he says, you've got to cut this out or cut that off. He always treats the effect. He never treats the cause. Medical science isn't in the business of treating causes. They're in the business of treating effects. And lawyers don't treat causes either. Lawyers wait until after you've committed the crime or gotten into trouble. When did you ever go to a lawyer to find out how to avoid legal problems? No. You go to the lawyer after you've got the legal problem. Well, over here in chapter 18, we come to a book that's rather unique and interesting in that this fellow Ezekiel was a slave on the river Kibar. He's a Jewish fellow, if that's the right term. He's really an Israelite of the tribe of Judah, and he's sitting in this concentration camp. These visions, or he gets these revelations from God, and he writes these down, and he's called a prophet. Now, I don't know what your religious philosophies are. As I've said, I'm a pagan. I'm not a Christian, and I don't claim to be. What I am is a businessman, and I'm trained to solve problems. And when I see a problem, the first thing I want to do is go to the cause so that I can eliminate the cause so that I don't have that problem again. And in my research, I've determined that and come to the conclusion with others of like minds, and what I've used is a multitude of counsel. And we've taken a look at this thing called usury, and here's what we found. In verse 5 of chapter 18, it begins, but if a man be just and do that which is lawful and right, and has not eaten upon the mountains, and neither has lifted up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, and neither has defiled his neighbor's wife, and I want to write some of these down because we're talking about idolatry, and we're talking about adultery here. Okay? Well, we have laws in our society today concerning adultery and rape and some things like that. And let's see, we've got idols and idolatry here. And has, verse 7 here he goes on to say, and has not oppressed any, but has restored to the debtor. He's paid his debts, his pledge, and has spoiled none by violence, and has given his bread to the hungry, and has covered the naked with a garment. Those are kind of laudatory things. People go to church all the time, and they do those things, don't they? He has not given forth upon usury. Now here's this, whatever usury is, and we've checked it out and found that it's taking of interest. Look at this, usury, adultery, and idolatry go together, don't they? Neither has taken any increase, so he hasn't paid interest or taken interest. That has required or has drawn his hand from iniquity, so whatever this adultery, idolatry, and usury is, it's called iniquity. And iniquity in Scripture is translated as sin, and sin in 1 John 3:4 is called, sin is the transgression of the law. So you break the law, that's sin. sin is iniquity, has executed true judgment between man and man, has walked in my statutes, has kept my judgments to deal truly, he is just and he shall surely live. So the benefits of this then is you shall live if you do these things. If you do the good things and you don't do the bad things, you'll live. Now starting off in verse 10. If he begets a son who is a robber, so let's put down a robber. You know, those are the guys that go in with a gun to Circle K and hold it up. That's a robber. A shedder of blood. Well, isn't that a killer? Isn't that someone who sheds blood? Wouldn't you have to shoot somebody and draw blood? Wouldn't you have to cut them or do something to them? So, murder. And that does any like to any of these things, you know, or similar type common law crimes. Those are dealing with losses of life, liberty, and property. And does not any of those duties, but even has eaten upon the mountains, defiled his neighbor's wife. So here's a guy who commits adultery. I guess it could be a woman also. In verse 12, has oppressed the poor and the needy, has spoiled by violence, has not restored his pledge, didn't pay his debt, and has lifted up his eyes to the idols, and has committed abomination, has given forth upon usury. Now here comes this usury again. And has taken increase, so he gives usury, that is, he pays it with his mortgage payment, and accepts it from the bank, so he gives forth and takes usury. Shall he then live? He shall not live. He has done all these abominations, he shall surely die, and his blood shall be upon him. Now, I don't preach religion, so I'm going to leave that to you. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to stick with the facts as I see them. Somewhere along the line, in 1792, we developed the Coinage Act of 1792, and we forever forbade the use of paper money. So said Sherman in Article 1, Section 10. Remember those 17 famous words? No state shall make anything but gold and silver, a tender in payment of debts. And between 1792 and about 1900 or 1920, along in there, when we had gold and silver, we from a backward 13 colonies became the most dominant and the most productive and the richest and most powerful nation in the world without any foreign aid whatsoever from anybody, to my knowledge. But yet something has happened and we've begun to decline, haven't we? And somewhere along the line we entered with the banksters and we entered with paper money, and we have enmeshed ourselves in a system of false money which now steals the substance of our neighbor. When we give him paper, we take his substance and give nothing in return. Well, the banksters did it to us, and so we do it to the next guy. And it ultimately carries some penalties with it. There are criminal penalties, so says Ezekiel, that follow along. Now, whether or not the book of Ezekiel is appropriate or apropos to the United States of America today, I'll leave for you to decide. All I can tell is that as a manufacturer and as a businessman, I see that we have cause here. We've got real problems with our law enforcement growth industry. We've got real problems with our money. And we have real problems with our rights and our freedoms. And I find here that we take and give usury. We've enmeshed ourselves into phony money, and money is the root cause of our problems. When we go back to gold and silver, we're going to find the law enforcement growth industry will begin to disappear. When we go back to obeying the laws, and when we go back to practicing the Ten Commandments, we're going to find that we're going to have more righteous men and less fear and less trepidation unless fleeing when none pursues us. You know, it's hard to find a man who's willing to go to jail for his rights. But it's also hard to find a man that doesn't give or take usury. Now, I stopped doing that, and I know a lot of other people that have stopped, and I think that there is an inverse proportion to obedience to the Ten Commandments. The more you obey the Ten Commandments, the freer you will become. I don't know why. I just know that's the way it works. If we're going to restore our Constitution, then, the more we adhere to the principles of James Madison and obey those Ten Commandments, which is the precept upon which that document is founded. And if we will stay away from usury, which with gold and silver, you can't charge usury because it's substance. And substance comes out of the ground. All wealth comes out of the ground. When we deal with gold and silver or honest money, with labor and with land, we will be dealing at the common law and we'll be dealing with the Ten Commandments. And when we deal with the